Hello everybody, I'm Axel Wilkinson, back again for another HitFilm tutorial. Today, we're going to take a quick look at depth of field. Just like real cameras, the virtual cameras in HitFilm allow you to employ selective focus to draw attention to the most important aspects of your shot. In your video footage, this will be handled by your camera while shooting on set, but when working in HitFilm's 3D compositing environment, you can also limit the focus when required. In case you are not familiar with the term depth of field, it basically refers to the distance between the nearest and farthest objects in your scene, which will appear to be in focus in the final image. Even though a lens can actually only achieve perfect focus at one distance at a time, the decrease in sharpness on each side of this distance is gradual. So, the depth of field is the distance between the 2 points where the unsharpness becomes apparent. Here we have 10 numbers getting progressively farther away from the camera. The camera settings can be adjusted so that nearly everything is in focus, as seen here. The 1 is a bit blurry, and the 2 is slightly blurry, but everything from the 3 to the 10 is acceptably sharp. This is called deep focus, or a large depth of field. We can also adjust the camera settings so that only a small area falls in focus, and everything else blurs out. Here, for example, we have focused on the 7. But the 6 and the 8 are also still reasonably sharp. So our depth of field is measured as the distance from the 6 to the 8. Shallow depth of field of this sort is commonly used in films to lead the audience's eye to the most important part of the scene. By default, the cameras in HitFilm are set so that everything is in focus all the time. This ensures that when just adding effects to a scene or performing basic composites, that the effects you create will never accidentally fall out of focus. To manually control the focus or adjust our depth of field, the first thing we need to do is enable the depth of field control in the camera's layer properties. There are a number of controls that will influence the depth of field, but none of them will have any effect until this control is enabled. The depth of field is determined by the combination of values assigned in the lens controls for your HitFilm camera. As we adjust the aperture, the larger the value we assign, the shallower the depth of field will be. So as I change the aperture, notice what happens to this text, which is receding from the camera. Right now everything is in focus, but as I increase that aperture setting, we gradually get some blurring back there, and the higher I set it, the farther that blur advances toward the camera. More and more of the text becomes blurred. The focus distance controls the distance from the camera at which perfect focus is achieved. So as I increase this, notice how right now our focus is right about here on this line that says camera's layer properties. And we get a little bit of blurring as we get closer to the camera here, and then a lot of blurring farther on. But as I increase the focus distance, now perfect focus is being achieved at a greater distance from the camera. So now here where the focus originally was, we have blurring, and we're getting perfect focus somewhere back in here. Blur controls how much blur is applied in the out of focus areas. As we increase that, we're just going to blur things more and more so we lose more detail. Zoom changes the focal length of the lens. A higher zoom is the equivalent of a telephoto lens, while a low zoom value is more of a wide angle. And increasing the zoom will make the depth of field more shallow. For example, here you can see we've got 4 lines of text there that are relatively in focus without too much blurring. But as I increase the zoom, you see now we only have 3 lines that are very in focus. The more you zoom, the shallower that depth of field will become. So in this case, the more we zoom in, the fewer lines of text will remain in focus. The distance from the camera to the subject is also a factor in depth of field, but this is basically tied into focus distance, because if you want to shorten the focus distance, you'll also have to move the camera closer to your subject so that the subject will still fall in focus. I'm going to right click and reset the zoom value there. Now if I change the focus distance, let's say to 1000, now the focus distance is much closer to the camera than our text is. So if we want to use a focus distance of 1000, we'll have to move the camera forward until the focus falls where we want it to. So we've got a number of factors here that all interact to determine our depth of field. Let's review them to make sure we understand the role that each one plays. As we adjust the aperture, decreasing the aperture will give us a great depth of field. Increasing the aperture will give us a shallow depth of field. As we change the zoom, a low zoom angle equivalent to a wide angle lens will give us greater depth of field, and a higher zoom angle will reduce our depth of field or make it more shallow. With the focus distance, the closer to the camera we're focused, the shallower our depth of field will be. Focusing farther away will create greater depth of field. And the blur controls how much blur is applied outside of our field of focus. So if we increase this, the same area is going to stay in focus, but we're going to get more blur outside of that area. And we are done. Those are the controls which impact the depth of field. So once you get the hang of working with those together, you can very quickly set up your cameras so that the focus is exactly where you want it to be within your 3D HitFilm scenes. Well, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, because we're constantly working on new tutorials for you and our other HitFilm users. So if you subscribe, then you'll make sure and be able to catch all of those tutorials as they're released. Bye for now.